And now, Mrs. Maria Donovan, the President of Catalyst for Renewal.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. It's my pleasant duty on behalf of Catalyst for Renewal to welcome you all here tonight to this, our first foray into organising a public forum of this size. In particular, I welcome our eminent speakers who have so generously accepted our invitation to be here tonight, and Geraldine Doog, one of our members, for so graciously taking on the role of moderator. I'll hand you over to Geraldine in a moment. Seated in the rows immediately in front of the speakers are some of our patrons and donors and representatives from those who support Catalyst both philosophically and in more practical ways. These include distinguished members of Catholic education offices and halls of learning, major superiors of religious congregations and their counsellors, and some who will be known to many, Bishop John Heaps and Bishop Pat Power, Morris and Joy West, Maisie Dunn, Professor Peter Sheehan, Vice-Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University, Mr Tony Harris, Auditor-General in New South Wales, Mr Chris McGillian, Editor of the Opinions page at the Sydney Morning Herald, Ms Carolyn Jones, Ron and Mrs Muirlock, and Donna Westerwheeler, who is the editor of the Catholic Weekly, Jerry and Francis Gleeson, Dr Richard and Janice Mulhern, and last but not least, my husband David and our daughter Susan. So to everyone, including our volunteers, many of whom are helping us tonight, welcome. We feel that tonight is a significant step in the history of Catalyst for Renewal. Our group, and indeed our spirituality, continue to develop. As we welcome you joyfully here tonight, we invite you to participate in that development and in our mission as together we struggle to help to contribute to the future of the Australian Church. Those of you who have attended spirituality in the pub at one of our 16 or 17 venues, or who subscribe to our journal The Mix, or who have attended one or more of our dinners or forums for the future, will know that at the heart of our mission is conversation. We believe that if people are willing to engage in conversation, there is reason to hope. This is our mission statement. We are believers who are attempting to establish a forum for conversation within the Catholic Church of Australia. Our aim is to prompt open exchanges among the community of believers, mindful of the diversity of expression of faith in contemporary Australia. This springs explicitly from the spirit of Pope John XXIII and Vatican II, as stated in Gaudium et Spes. Let there be unity in what is necessary, freedom in what is unsettled, and charity in any case. The statement of conclusion, the focus of our public forum tonight, as well as describing certain positive aspects of the Australian Church, contains some negative and defensive statements. We meet tonight, and hopefully in the future, to learn more about the statement of conclusions, to support and encourage each other and our bishops, to discuss some of the challenges we are facing, and provide further impetus towards an ongoing and vigorous conversation for renewal of our Church in Australia. We are looking to move forward. As one of our speakers, Robert Fitzgerald, said on the Four Corners program a few weeks ago, the Church must not be fearful of the modern world. I would like to conclude with a few brief words about conversation. Good conversation involves mutual involvement, a disposition to openness, a gentleness and an inquiring mind. It does not involve defending an ideology, name-calling, raised voices or telling. Finally, may I state that an integral part of conversation is listening. Let us listen tonight not only to each other, but most importantly to the movement of the Holy Spirit in our midst. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to stand and join in our opening prayer, which is the hymn, Come Holy Ghost Creator Come, the words of which you will find in your program, and Sister Catherine Tyrrell, RSJ, will lead us in this invocation of the Holy Spirit.
Come, Holy Ghost Creator, come from your bright heavenly throne. Come, take possession of our souls and make them all your own. Oh, guide our minds with your blessed light, with love.
Hello and welcome tonight, ladies and gentlemen, to this special meeting to consider the Catholic Church of the next generation and the roles you and I will play in it, the commitment we'll bring to it, the hopes we have for it. I'm Geraldine Doog and I'm to be your moderator tonight, and I would like to outline first and foremost our order of events for the next 2 hours. We like to keep time in Catalyst, and so we will try to. 2 hours is our aim. But I would like to first thank Sister Kathleen Tyrrell, who led us in the singing. Will you please thank her, ladies and gentlemen? Now, we shall have 5 speakers tonight, and I'll introduce them to you individually. They'll speak for 8 to 10 minutes each. I shall try to keep it under control. I've never done that to a bishop before, but I'll attempt to do so. I heard people in the audience saying, we don't want speeches, we want to talk, we want to converse, so we will keep that as our aim. We're going to ask you, that should leave us 50 minutes roughly, by the way, about 50 minutes or so for some good discussion, which I think we'll all look forward to. Now, we're going to ask you to write your questions down. Because we've just got such a big number of people, we think it is better if we can write the questions down and they will be handed up to me. We'll have various people running around the hall for you to hand your question sheets to. We have run out of them already, so we're sort of ripping up bits of paper to try to give them to you, but you may have to ferret in your own bags for ways to write your questions down. But we will be sifting them at the side here under the leadership of Professor Tim O'Hearn and Kate Engelbrecht and his wife Margaret, and they will choose representative questions because we assume there'll be a lot, and we'll try to get some patterns in those questions, and they'll be handed up to me, and then I'll hand them to the individual speakers, or I'll put them to the panel. Now, bearing all that in mind, we might get underway, or blow that whistle ref, as Michael Whelans want to remind me. Can I welcome our first speaker tonight, Bishop Brian Heenan, who's flown down from Rockhampton to be with us, so we're most grateful. He was one of the bishops who actually signed the Statement of Conclusions, which has sparked tonight's meeting, and he did that in his capacity as chairman of the Catholic Bishops' Committee for Clergy and Religious. And so we hope he can tell us firsthand about the context and the background of the statement, because I think there's quite a bit of confusion about it and how it came to be. Ladies and gentlemen, Bishop Brian Heenan.
Thank you very much, Geraldine, and thank you all for the welcome. I'm delighted to be here tonight. Why am I here? Let me say, essentially because I love the church. I love particularly the church in Australia, and I'm privileged to be the shepherd for a wonderful people in central Queensland who are the Diocese of Rockhampton. I'm here not speaking on behalf of the other bishops, much less the Bishops' Conference. These reflections are solely mine. Because I love Jesus and the church he established, I'm concerned, like you all, over the hurt and confusion and division which is affecting our church at this time. So I've come here tonight to be part of a dialogue which will address at least some of the issues that concern us and to give of our best in promoting unity in Christ's work. Unity can live with diversity. Unity must live with tension. Unity cannot live with closed minds, anger or pettiness. My invitation was to tell something of the story of the Statement of Conclusions, which emanated from the Australian Bishops' meeting in Rome. You'll be aware that there were 3 events in Rome for the Australian Bishops last November-December: the Synod of Oceania, the 5 yearly or ad limina visits, the special meeting between some Australian bishops and the cardinal prefects of some Vatican congregations and their secretaries. The 3 events were totally separate. It's about the special meeting that I wish to speak tonight, and that meeting was special because such a meeting had not been held before. Representatives of the Australian bishops meeting with representatives of the Roman Curia. The Curia, through Cardinal Ratzinger, called the meeting. At the 98 conference, Australian Bishops' Conference, Cardinal Clancy announced to the Central Commission that the Curia wanted to meet to discuss the state of the Church in Australia. He named the 5 committees to be involved through their chairman and secretaries, namely Clergy and Religious, Liturgy, Education, Evangelisation, Doctrine and Morals. The Archbishops of Australia were also to attend if they were not already included, so that there were 15 of us altogether. I was there as the chairman for the Bishops' Committee for Clergy and Religious. From the Roman side, the congregations or dicasteries included were Doctrine of the Faith, Congregation for the Clergy, Divine Worship and Discipline of the Sacraments, Congregation for Bishops, and the Congregation for Institutes of Religious Life and Societies of Apostolic Life. In addition to the presentations for the Australian bishops for the 5 committees mentioned, Cardinal Clancy gave a paper on the role of bishops. The Australian presenters went first. They had approximately 30 minutes, and there was time for clarification before the next presentation. The papers were written by the presenters, taking whatever advice they chose. In most cases, we, the general body of the bishops, did not know what was in the presentations. They were required in Rome several months ahead of the meeting. We did not see the Roman presentations. Again, after the Roman presentations, there was time for clarifications. It was then a time of free discussions for the remaining part of the 4 days. The chairing of each day was alternated between the Roman and the Australians. Archbishop Faulkner and Archbishop Carroll were our representatives. There was a very efficient translation service. The room we met in was the Sala Bologna, which was a very beautiful place to meet, and I'll just summarise it all by saying it was a very friendly atmosphere, a very welcoming event, and even when there were criticisms of the Church in Australia, there was no acrimony. The Holy Father visited us on one occasion, which was an unexpected privilege. Towards the end of the discussion days, it was determined that a small group would meet to draw the conclusions together. 2 from each side were chosen, Cardinal Clancy and Bishop Putney from our side, and Archbishop Bertoni and Archbishop Pittow from the Curia. They were to meet at least 6 times to compile a document from quotations of what had been said or from other sources. Those of us who had taken part were called together almost 3 weeks later on Wednesday the 9th of December to consider the final draft. I must admit it was a surprise when all of the Roman officials turned up to that meeting when we thought it would be only representatives. I'm just going to have a drink of water because I'm hurrying before Geraldine tunes me out. Well, there was a different meeting or different atmosphere at that meeting to my way of thinking, and there was a certain indication that there was a finality about the statement as it was then put together. I remember one comment being made that the section on religious life was very long and unnecessarily dominating the document, but the reply was it had already been reduced. I must acknowledge that there was strong disappointment on the part of some of the other Australian bishops who felt excluded from the input and the discussions that had taken place over those 4 days. The feeling was to rise again when the statement of conclusion was presented to all of the Australian bishops 3 weeks later, just prior to the signing. We gathered on Friday afternoon, the 11th of December, and the document was distributed to the other 25 Australian bishops who had not seen it previously. After an introduction by Cardinal Ratzinger, the signing was called for, and the remaining Australian bishops had but a few minutes to peruse it. I'd like to say a little bit about my own signing of the Statement of Conclusions, perhaps presenting some of what you might have read in the mix. The signatories to the statement were decided after a debate at the final consideration of the draft. It was agreed that it should be signed as a record of the dialogue having taken place. After several discussions, it was decided that the President of the Australian Bishops' Conference, Cardinal Clancy, the Chairman of the Australian Committees, together with the Cardinal Prefects of the Roman congregations involved, should be the signatories. I did not sign it on behalf of all the Australian bishops, as I knew I had no right to. They had no input into the 4-day meeting, and they had no chance to adequately read the finished document before the signing. I must point out that some of the signatories believed that they were signing it on behalf of the Australian bishops. I was not. I was signing off on some conclusions of a meeting, not conclusions about the whole Australian Church. I point out Cardinal Ratzinger's introductory words, which clarified the matter for me. He said, "The signing of the document signifies that it is a fair representation of the dialogue that took place during the intercasterial meeting regarding some of the doctrinal and pastoral issues challenging the Church in Australia." I'd like to say a brief word about the strength of the document from my point of view. Cardinal Ratzinger, in speaking of the document, says, "After reading the document, it is hoped that each bishop will see that he can readily and easily give his support to its proposals and directions." To use words like "it is hoped" and to speak of proposals and directions, to me, does not give it great strength. He goes on to say, "It provides guidelines to the local bishop to affirm, admonish or correct as he sees fit, according to what is called for in each circumstance." In saying that, I'm not rejecting the statement or its context, but I am saying that this is how I see its origin. May I conclude with some further observations? It should be kept in mind that the sources for the conclusions document are what the Australian bishops presented, together with what their quinquennial or ad limina reports contained, together with the complaints that flow in from Australia through the pronuncio or directly, together with what the Roman authorities themselves presented. It is clear that some of the material was to be found in other statements like Vita Consecrata and addresses to other groups. I acknowledge that for me things are much clearer now after we have arrived home. When I arrived home after a few days in Manila from the Roman experience, I was surprised to find the negative reaction to my Roman visit. I soon discovered that the press had conveyed the document as an attack on the Church in Australia. I think the great mistake was to publish it so swiftly. It was a document for the bishops initially, and before we could consider it together, it was published with undue haste on the internet and through a press conference. Some of us had sought to delay its publishing, but to no avail. The bishops were in transit. Many did not return to their dioceses until Christmas or later. I repeat again, it was really the conclusions of a meeting, not of the entire Australian conference or the Australian Church. Can I say very quickly, I've had the benefit of sharing the colloquium with 75 religious and priests and enjoyed experiencing their love for the Church, their deep appreciation of their own role, the role of the laity, and the great support they have given to us, to our bishops. The Bishops' Conference last week in Sydney, as you know, issued a letter which I think has clarified some of the issues a little bit further. There is much to say in the document about the role of the bishop, religious, priest, liturgy and education, which is worthwhile and very much to be taken to heart. It does omit many of the strengths of the Church. It is said to be a document considering only the weaknesses, but it is perceived, rightly or wrongly, as a kind of a report card with many aspects not being marked. The weaknesses are to be considered seriously, as they are not just a Roman perception, but they must be evaluated within our own context. I believe it reflects what I've always believed, that tension always exists between the universal and the local church that will never change. Both are essential to our church. I strongly believe the Roman Curia has little hope of understanding and supporting the local church, living the gospel in its own culture, unless it has reliable contact and deep respect for inculturation of the gospel. The Pope's written address to the Australian bishops, taken namely from the Statement of Conclusions, does add considerable weight to it and gives direction to us bishops. But he also said very clearly, we must acknowledge that there are weaknesses in our church, yet I believe the Holy Father was being very positive and asking us to renew our efforts to shepherd the church through difficult times. In fact, these were his words: I wish to encourage you to look to the profound strength of the Catholic community in Australia, which in the midst of often disconcerting change continues to listen to the Word of God and to bear abundant fruits of holiness and evangelical service. May I say, all of this conflict, all of this striving and struggling wearies me as a pastor in today's church. So I'm glad to be here tonight to contribute with you all to something better. So infrequently, we are focusing upon God himself. So infrequently, the people of God and their spiritual needs seem to be forgotten. We live in the spirit of Vatican II, when the church is the people of God. Our primary call is to nurture our relationship with God. All else is secondary. Others, I know, will speak in a very positive way as the evening progresses. May I simply conclude and say, can we take up the challenge of Jesus when he says, by this shall all know that you are my disciples, if you truly love one another. And then, after the wonderful gospel that we shared last weekend, and only then, will we walk the Emmaus road together and experience our hearts burning within us. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Heenan. Beautifully kept time. Thank you very much, even if it took a couple of years off your life. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Sister Annette Cunliffe, who's a Sister of Charity. She was elected as their congregational leader 3 years ago, and her ministry has been devoted to secondary education and latterly to teacher education. She's also now the president of the Conference of Leaders of Religious Institutes, and it's in that capacity that I ask her to address us tonight about her responses as a religious. Sister Annette Cunliffe.
Good evening. It's my privilege and pleasure to be here. Despite some sections of the document which I found enlightening and enriching, my overall response is one of disappointment with the statement. I asked for comments from other leaders of religious institutes, and one graphically summed up her experience of the document using the image of being alternately patted on the head and skewered in the stomach. The aim of the meetings was better understanding of the situation of the Church in Australia. If the statement reflects that better understanding, the meetings seem to have fallen far short of their aim, as the document's portrayal does not ring true to the experience of a large number of Catholics. There is also a sense in which the statement suffers from internal contradictions. While asking bishops to foster unity and prevent factions and divisions, the press release which accompanied the document acknowledged that some of the issues which occasioned the meetings emerged from other reports received by the 6 Roman congregations. This seems to make it evident that groups or individuals have reported issues directly to Rome. This course of action is perceived by many as a significant source of such factions and divisions. The Bishop's statement last week discouraging this approach was most welcome. No one could argue with the fact that both positive and negative aspects are evident in the Church here. We are both the mystical body continuing to live out the mission of Christ and the pilgrim people of God, made up of flawed, sinful people, though loved and forgiven through Christ's saving action. I accept the statement's challenge to us to live more authentically as the Australian face of the mystical body. However, I found the preponderance of negative comments disturbing. The imbalance was in fact startling. For example, there was just one paragraph devoted to positive aspects of the current situation, followed by 5 addressing a weakness, a crisis, challenges and problems. A similar pattern can be found throughout most of the document. Like most thinking and involved Catholics, I acknowledge the weaknesses, challenges, problems and probably even crises facing us. One of my concerns, though, is that the statement fails to define clearly the significant issues and omits direct mention of some major concerns we face. One of these, the scandal of sexual and physical abuse, continues to affect deeply the morale of all members of the Church. The statement deals with the role of the priest. It alleges attempts to marginalise the priesthood and to cloud the identity of the priest when tasks have been entrusted to laity that belong to the ministerial priesthood. It further refers to excessive involvement of the priest in areas that should be attended to by a committed and well-formed laity. I believe that the statement does us a great service by calling attention to the essential role of the priest, but it certainly does not suggest a way forward. It does not seem to me to have faced squarely the reality of the scarcity of priests. The only reference to priestly vocations comes in the section on the bishop, which states his duty to promote all vocations, especially to the priesthood. There is apparently no recognition of the reality that we are facing in many places in Australia, that the faithful are deprived of even weekly Eucharist because there are simply too few priests spread over vast distances. To me, any serious exploration of the situation of the Church in Australia must acknowledge this. The positive aspects of the statement ring true to my experience of church, but the omission from the meeting, and therefore the statement, of some significant aspects, particularly the laity and our efforts for social justice, make this seem a very inward-looking document. One must surely ask why these aspects were omitted and what effect these omissions have had on Rome's understanding of the Church in Australia. I am puzzled by the conclusions surrounding the issue of a decline in the sense of sin. I am certain that the situation is not so simple. Indeed, the numbers who have been attending both the second and third rites of reconciliation suggest to me the emergence of a widespread realisation of sin and its communal dimension. The extent of interest in and discussion about sacramental reconciliation reinforce this. Another statement I found extremely puzzling was that the Church does not create her own ordering and structuring, but receives them from Christ himself. This is not how I see Christ's relationship to the Church. I cannot describe my response to the statement without reference to the section on religious life. As in other places, it commences with the affirmation of consecrated life, then proceeds immediately to emphasise problems and areas of concern. I see the paragraph on the decline in religious vocations as simplistic, both in its analysis of the situation and the suggested response. The paragraph states, "The Church in Australia is undergoing a difficult period due to the decline in vocations to the consecrated life." Many would see this decline as a sign of the times and perhaps a result rather than the cause of a difficult period for the Church. Though I strongly support the statement's vision of religious life as not isolated or marginal, but a reality which affects the whole church, the number of vocations is not, I believe, the cause of problems for the church. The call to authenticity of life for religious which follows is surely more central. However, the placement of that call to authenticity could imply that its absence is seen as the cause of the decline in vocations. No doubt such authenticity is essential, but there are many other complex influences leading to the decline in the numbers seeking to follow Christ as religious. The previous large numbers entering religious life may even have been the aberration. Some suggest that the consecrated life was never meant to attract large numbers. The enhanced opportunity for other members of the laity to contribute actively and even in full-time ministry to the church is no doubt a factor. This is seen by many as freeing religious to return to their original purpose, not to be a workforce in the church, but, in the words of Joan Chittister, a spiritual voice, a countercultural sign, a prophetic presence in the culture. This indeed requires real authenticity of life that enables individual religious and congregations as a whole to stand with the marginalised in society and to respond to their situation, challenging society and even the church to address injustices that cause such marginalisation. The response suggested in the statement to the decline in numbers seeking to enter religious life, the church must pray for vocations, is no doubt valid, but again overly simplistic. There is a further suggestion that religious are responsible to propose the ideal of following Christ and then to support the response to the Spirit's action in the heart of those who are called. If this implies that the consecrated life is the only or even a more valid way to follow Christ, it contradicts the understanding of religious life articulated in the documents of Vatican II. Alternatively, if it calls religious, like the bishops, to propose and support all Christian vocational calls, this is indeed central to our mission. The statement points to some specific issues pertinent to religious life: formation, community living, associate members, and communion with the church. The concerns raised under the heading formation are foreign to my experience, as is the statement's warning that conferences of major superiors are not organs of parallel authority to that of the bishops. I hope that our positive relationships with our bishops ensure that this is not our perception or theirs. Are these references to specifics of the Australian Church? I am genuinely concerned if that is so. The issue of styles of community living is undoubtedly one that religious institutes are struggling with today. However, rather than trying to put back the clock, we must live through the struggle with honesty and discernment, and remember that in the history of religious life, such struggles have characterised times in which new movements in religious life emerged, from the time of the hermits of the desert until now. I see the question of associate members as a similar issue. This is not a new concept, and the document acknowledges its value. As in so many other sections, though, this acknowledgement is followed by a however, warning essentially that boundaries must not be blurred. Is this clarity of boundaries really a more significant value than sharing the charism of the Religious Institute with close colleagues? That'll be fine. The section on consecrated life concludes on a negative note with references to concerns shared with our bishops by the relevant congregation. Presumably these are concerns additional to those already mentioned. The document lists concerns related to prayer for ecclesial vocations, deepening both communion with the Church and assent to the magisterium regarding such areas as the non-ordination of women to the priesthood, the theology of the Church and of the sacraments of faith, the theology of communion and moral problems. Some of these are serious matters. Communion with the Church has been mentioned twice. Personally, my experience does not lead me to see lack of communion as a major issue for religious institutes, though I'm conscious of occasional tensions. However, throughout history, such tension has characterised times of transition in religious life and the Church. We are facing such a transition time, no doubt threatening to us all, religious, the Church as a whole, our bishops and the Roman Curia. We are again left to find our own way forward. I trust that the suggested dialogue between the bishops and major superiors will occur, or rather continue, but that it will not be confined to these perceived problems. I cannot conclude my response on a negative note. The statement finds much to praise in the Australian Church. It also raises issues we ignore at our peril. In some ways, like Sydney's storm last week, the statement has been a galvanising force, uniting the laity, including religious, with priests and bishops. As with any experience or opportunity, we need to engage with it in prayerful discernment, together with our fellow people of God, and ensure that it stimulates us to be more open to the Spirit working through the Church. Only this will secure her continued ability to incarnate Christ authentically in our country and our world.
Thank you, Sister Annette. Now, look, I don't know quite what conclusions we might draw from this, but after our next speaker, Robert Fitzgerald, appeared with me recently on a Four Corners program, I was quite surprised by the number of people who came up to me and said, I had no idea Robert was Catholic. And I thought I was sort of the bleeding obvious was on display, but clearly not so to a lot of people who simply thought that he was a very effective public advocate for disadvantaged people during his time as president of ACOS. Before that, of course, and obviously they didn't know this, but as many of you here no doubt will know, he'd been head of the St Vincent de Paul Society in New South Wales. He's a lawyer by training, and he's now continuing his great tradition of public service by taking on the role last year of Community Services Commissioner for New South Wales, where he monitors the quality of services provided by various state bodies and acts on complaints. No doubt he's audited by Tony Harris, who's here with us tonight, but we won't take that up. He's passionately interested, I think a lot of you know, in the next generation of the Catholic Church in Australia, and I look forward now to hearing his response to the statement of conclusions.
Well, thanks, Geraldine. Bishops, religious, priests, fellow travellers from the left and right of church, from the Conservatives and the Liberals, because I'm sure they're all here tonight. This is a moment of awesome joy to be here this evening, and it's one that I welcome in some senses. It's great to be here to take up the call of the bishops to enter into a prayerful collaboration in developing strategies for the future of the church. But it's an onerous privilege that I have. I don't pretend to be a scholar, for I'm not. I'm not a theologian, nor do I understand much of the theology of church. Much of what I might say tonight might not be correct, and I'm sure there are some in the gathering that will tell me I'm entirely wrong. And maybe I am. But all I can say to you are the things that I feel, that I think, after prayerful reflection, not only on the statement, but beyond. Tonight we come here because we are a people, a part of the faithful of our church, who have an authentic love of God and an overwhelming loyalty to the Catholic Church. There are some in our community who would say that the mere questioning, the mere debating, the mere discussing of these issues brings into question that loyalty. Yet the history of this church and the history of its saints shows that nothing could be further from the truth. It is those who have loved and have been loyal to the church that have taken the risks to raise the questions openly, honestly, and forthrightly. It is because of that love and loyalty that you are here tonight, to share our views, to express our concerns, and to put on the table our hopes. But just lest we should worry, we have a much easier road than in previous times. It was once said that when in Rome in 1846, Pope Gregory VI alternately blessed his subjects and then shot them. Pope Pius IX was much more generous, he simply imprisoned them. At least in Sydney that doesn't occur, although Melbourne, I'm not so sure. Prophetic dissent within the church is something that is part of our rich tradition. I really believe that the church is closest to the true expression of Christ's love when it is open, and it is furthest removed from the teachings of the gospel when it is closed and seeks to repress opinion. The statements of conclusion may well be a document that accurately reflects the dialogue that took place. It is a document that did give recognition to the great strengths of the Catholic Church, the intense collaboration between the bishops, priests, religious and laity, the active participation in liturgical celebrations, the Catholic education systems, our theological colleges and universities, the extraordinary corporal works of mercy, as they call them, the prophetic voice of this Australian Church on issues of social justice, and the invaluable contribution of religious to the life well of the Church. Yet, having read the document several times, I am constantly left with a sense of diminished, not enhanced optimism. It is not to say that the document of the statement does not have its great merits. It is right and proper that the leadership of our church should seek to provide guidance, to point out the strengths and weaknesses. Yet this document, I fear, may well hinder rather than energise the renewal of the church. I say that because history has taught us many things. When the church seeks to move back, fails to meet the genuine needs and aspirations of its people, and the authority of the church distance itself from the faithful, then the church will inevitably diminish. The hope is, however, that when the church embraces its people, engages with them and encourages active participation, then the church once again brings to life the love and truth of Jesus Christ. But this document is a document of concern. I have no doubt at all that the authors of the statement believe that they contribute to the revitalisation of the church. But this document, in many parts, is a document based more on the fear of losing what is, rather than celebrating the job opportunities that lay ahead. Throughout the history of the church, we as church are best when we move forward, and we are worst when we stay rooted in the past. That is not to lose the truths of the church based on the teachings of Christ. It is not to walk away from the gospel message, but it is to say this church has no option but to engage in the current and modern world. In a sense, the church does have a choice. It can anchor itself in the past to one point, like a boat that's anchored, and it can move around and around and around the anchor. Or it can move forward in a different way. It can be like a vessel with the crew and the people on it, skilled, trained, energised, so that it can move forward to travel to different parts, experiencing new worlds, but confident in and of itself, confident that the people in that vessel are with it, confident that wherever they go, the truths will stay. This is not a church that should anchor itself to go round and round, but is a church that must move forward, confident in its people, confident in the religious, the laity, the priests and the bishop. One of the difficulties of this document is the conclusion that it draws. There is one major conclusion in this document from which all else stems. It is the notion of the crisis of faith in Australia. However, I question whether that is the right conclusion. Sure, there is much wrong in the world, there is much wrong in church, and you could come to the conclusion that there is a crisis of faith. But the statement of conclusions, frankly, deals with quite a different crisis. There is a deep and questioning of the faith, but there is a crisis of confidence in the ability of the church to deal with that questioning. In many senses, the crisis... In many ways, this is an extraordinary dialogue and an extraordinary document, for in no way does it acknowledge the leadership's own weaknesses and inability to deal with the questions raised in relation to the faith by the faithful. It could be argued that the crisis is not so much a crisis of faith, but a crisis of the institutionalisation of that faith as we currently know it. It is simply this, that the faithful cry out daily for help to meet their needs. They cry out to a church to help them answer the needs of living life in this difficult world. And yet this document provides little guidance and little comfort for that. Perhaps the conclusion that I've come to is too uncomfortable. Because in one sense, when you read the document over and over again, whether it is intended or unintended, and I take it that it was never intended, that this document is not talking of crisis of faith, it is talking of the crisis of the faithful. In some senses, the sign of hope is diminished in this document because of its obsession with power and authority. And let us be very clear. In my public life of 20 years, I have expressed both public and private loyalty to the Church and the bishops. I do so again tonight, and I will do so until I die. But there is a false debate propagated by some in the Church. There is a battle, they say, between those who seek to maintain the authority of the Church versus those who seek to turn the Church into a political democracy. This is a false and phony debate. All of us understand clearly that the Church is not and never will be a democracy. Neither do most of us claim or want that. What we recognise, because of the very position of His Holiness and the divine authority that emanates from it, that democracy may not be appropriate for this Church. But what we do claim is that some of the very basic tenets of democracy, openness, transparency, and an active engagement in the people is something consistent with that and consistent with the teaching of the gospel. Put simply, it is because of the model of authority that we accept in church that places greatest onus on those who exercise that authority to engage the faithful. If this were a democracy, their responsibilities would be less. But because this is an authority given, not earned, it is one that therefore requires even greater engagement and listening to and responding to the needs of the faithful. It is that in which the great crisis of church really exists. Okay. What we have to do, I think, is this. In many senses, the document challenges us. We have to move forward. There are parts of the document and of recent statements that are of grave concern. Issues surrounding the Third Right and so on are of concern to many, although there would be others here that support that stand. What is missing from this document is the dealing with the major issues of our times. For us as a church in Australia, it is some of these. How do we become more relevant to the poor and the vulnerable of our communities who are no longer part of the church, a church that in many senses was established for them? How do we re-engage young people? How do we re-engage young people whose needs and aspirations are not being effectively met with the competition from the secular world? How do we bring to life the social teachings? How do we bring to life the social teachings of the church in the parishes and communities? Let me go to the conclusion, because she's about to axe me, although I've been axed by Geraldine before. Let me say the conclusion is this. Our church is a church of great hope, and we should be hopeful, because it is a church that has room for all the faithful, not just for some of us. All of us are at different stages of our faith, struggling to cope with life's journeys and the faith journey. We, however, must be very careful that we must never become a church only for the saints, but not for the sinners, for those who consider themselves saved, but not for the rest of us who are struggling to be saved. Such a church would be alien to the teachings of Christ and would call in our question our ability to love and to show that loyalty. This is a church in which there is room for diversity. Yes, there is a struggle within the church, a struggle not about the left and right, not about the primacy of conscience over the authority of the church, not about the belief in democracy over the current order. It is a struggle between a vision of a church that celebrates diversity, openness and love of expression, or a church of the elite, closed, safe and excluding of many. Tonight here, we come here because of our love and our loyalty to church. We come to work together. We come to bring life till we come to bring to life the reality of the risen Christ in our own lives and the world at large. Let us leave here with hope and confidence that this aspiration can be achieved. For that we pray, for that we must work together.
I don't think they liked it. Thank you, Robert. Father Michael Whelan wears a couple of hats. He's a Marist priest, he's a great teacher of theology, and many Sydney-siders who attended the Catholic Theological Institute at Hunters Hill, CTU, have benefited from his commitment to equipping people with mature adult faith to match their needs of living in our modern world with all our dilemmas. He's also the Executive Director of Catalyst for Renewal, and he's presided over its growth and is constantly reflecting on the best ways to foster a thriving Catholic Church in the contemporary Australia we know and love. I ask him now for his insights on the challenges posed by the statement for the Australian Church.
Fellow pilgrims, I suggest there are at least 4 good reasons why we should take the Statement of Conclusions very seriously. Firstly, this document is addressed to us specifically. It would be rude to ignore it. Secondly, the process whereby the document came into being is potentially very alienating and must not be allowed to pass unchallenged. Thirdly, there is an implicit content relating to authority and the nature of the Church that is opposed to the teaching and spirit of the Second Vatican Council. Fourthly, the style of communication in and around this document tends to create confusion and friction. All 4 factors adversely affect our efforts to be, as the Second Vatican Council asked, a communion of local churches united under Peter's successor, the Bishop of Rome. Let me take those factors one at a time. First of all, this document is addressed to us specifically. The Statement of Conclusions was written for us. It names us. It enjoins us explicitly to move in a certain direction. It comes with the blessing of the successor of Peter and bears the signatures of the most senior Vatican officials and a number of our own archbishops and bishops. The document raises issues that are of concern to us all. Issues such as the decline in church practice, especially among the young, the need for catechesis, and particularly adult education, and the way we celebrate the sacraments of reconciliation and Eucharist. It would be unfortunate if we did not take up these issues, and others, ourselves in a vigorous and responsible way. The second factor, the process here was closed and manipulated by the Roman Curia. In order to provide input on key areas from the Australian Church for the special meeting out of which the Statement of Conclusions emerged, I would have thought there would be some kind of open and thorough process of research and consultation. The chairman of the respective committees of our bishops' conferences would have been the obvious people to convene such a process. In fact, nothing like this happened. The archbishops handled these reports personally. I do not know the exact mandates given to our archbishops, but I am left wondering why they did not take some initiative to make the process more open and thorough. At the special meeting, the archbishops were given half an hour each to present their reports. The Roman Curia placed no such time restrictions on their own inputs. And when the document was finally presented for signing, omitting, it seems, some significant interventions from our own bishops, no time was given for careful study and open discussion of the final draft. The manipulation and lack of transparency raised some obvious questions. A justice question. When decisions that radically affect our lives are being made, should we not be part of the process if it is at all possible? A pastoral question. Where is the dialogue that so characterised Pope John XXIII and the Second Vatican Council, the dialogue for which Pope Paul VI called in his 1964 encyclical Ecclesiam Suam? A leadership question. Absence of dialogue, especially in regard to such serious matters, is more likely to promote alienation than cooperation. The third factor. The exercise of authority used here and the understanding of church implicit in this document are both contrary to the teachings and spirit of the Second Vatican Council. The Roman Curia has become a sort of counter-college to the College of Bishops. Overlords of those whom Lumen Gentium calls the ones who succeeded to the place of the apostles. There is a centralisation of authority in and by the Roman Curia that the Second Vatican Council explicitly wanted to reform. The former head of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the United States, Archbishop John Quinn, pointed this out in his landmark lecture at Campion Hall in 1996. More recently, the former Archbishop of Vienna, Cardinal Koenig, writes, "How can or should the present structure of command, which in the past century has become so centralized, be amended or improved? A gradual decentralization is needed so as to strengthen the concern and responsibility of the College of Bishops for the whole Church under and with the Petrine Office. That was the direction specified at the Second Vatican Council. At the same time, the competence of individual bishops, both locally and regionally, needs to be strengthened too, for they are the shepherds of their local churches, the vicars of Christ in their own dioceses. That is why Vatican II described the Church as a communion of local churches." The Second Vatican Council, in fact, gave no single image of the Church. It did, however, as Cardinal Koenig implies here, begin to point to communion and community as terms of significance, emphasizing collegiality, subsidiarity, and the primacy of people over law and structure, using terms like people of God and pilgrim people, and recalling that it is the sacrament of baptism that gives us all equally our Christian identity. In this vision for the Church, the starting point is the community of the baptized, not the structure or the law or the hierarchy or the dogma, essential as these are. The statement of conclusions, to all intents and purposes, ignores this vision of the Council. Instead, it reverts to a very juridical understanding of church, focusing as it does on the bishops, priests and religious, and issues of organisation and doctrinal orthodoxy. As a consequence, it tends, on the one hand, to have a skewed view of the legitimate issues it does raise, and on the other hand, it tends to overlook other issues that ought to be raised by such a document. For example, it sees tolerance and feminist scholarship and the questioning of classical anthropology and the suggestion that the Church needs to be reorganized as threats, but doesn't seem interested, for example, in the need for dialogue with the emerging culture, or the considerable array of challenges to family life, or the shortcomings of our traditional moral thinking and its teaching, and the deep pain and alienation it has caused and still causes many, or the fact that a growing number of Catholic communities are unable to celebrate the Eucharist because there's no priest available. The fourth factor, This document is saying more than it's saying. To use a good Australian phrase, the communication in this document is not fair dinkum. It bears all the hallmarks of hidden agenda. Given the secrecy and manipulation associated with its development, the incoherence and lack of cogency of some of its more significant content, I believe the real agenda is implicit rather than explicit. And this agenda is about power and maintenance of a certain organisational system, regardless of whether that system enhances or diminishes the Church's ability to be a sign or sacrament of God's liberating love in the world. The Vatican civil servants have made themselves, contrary to Church teaching, the Holy Father's primary collaborators. Forgive me for seeing a parallel here with that best of all British comedies, Yes, Minister. The means has triumphed over the ends. Without impugning their motives, I must express my loyal opposition, precisely because I am a committed Catholic, a religious for more than 32 years and a priest for almost 27 of those years, and I wish to remain all three until I die, whenever that might be. By way of conclusion, as a local church, we in Australia need to be, and want to be, I believe, a faithful part of that communion of local churches scattered throughout the world. In no way do we want to undermine the authority of Peter. On the contrary, we want to see that authority flourish in a way that serves the communion of local churches and helps us all to be sacraments or signs of God's liberating love in our world. The statement of conclusions, in fact, undermines the authority of Rome and brings the gospel into disrepute by claiming too much and by doing it in such ill-informed, clumsy and insensitive ways. By way of welcome contrast, the recent letter to the Catholic people of Australia from our own bishops strikes the right note. We encourage a constructive dialogue that builds harmony. We invite your prayerful collaboration in developing strategies to respond to the issues raised at all meetings in Rome and in discerning what the Spirit is asking of the Church in Australia at the beginning of the third millennium of Christianity. The greatest significance of the statement of conclusions may, in the end, be that it serves as a wake-up call, uniting the people with their bishops in addressing the considerable challenges that lie before us. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael Whelan. And I do remind you there'll be opportunity for questions after our next speaker. Now, our last speaker was in Rome for the Oceania Synod, though he wasn't at some of these meetings we've heard about. He's an auxiliary bishop in Sydney and also wears several hats. He's chairman of the Catholic Bishops' Conference National Committee for Professional Standards and has played a leading role in the response to the sexual abuse crisis, and also secretary... and he's also secretary to its Committee on Canon Law. Above all, the hope is that tonight's meeting can be constructive in terms of the Church's future, and it's in that spirit that I invite Bishop Robertson to address the question, where to from here?
My sisters and brothers in Christ, on the first day of the Synod for Oceania last November, I addressed the Pope and the assembled cardinals and bishops on the subject of sexual abuse. Among other things, I said, "It is only the universal Church that has the authority to make the changes that are needed. We request the universal Church to become closely involved in this issue, to speak directly and openly to victims of abuse and to the whole community, and to take all necessary concrete steps to prevent abuse in the future." After this talk, I was able to speak with some Vatican officials on this matter with a view to ongoing dialogue. Later, a resolution reflecting what I had said was passed almost unanimously by the Synod, and therefore by a large majority of the curial cardinals who were present. I would strongly reject the idea that because this was not part of the meeting that led to the statement of conclusions, it was therefore unimportant and irrelevant. Many other bishops spoke at the Synod on subjects close to their hearts. Some European bishops who had attended many Roman meetings said that the bishops at this Synod spoke more openly and more forcefully than at any other meeting they could remember. Some Vatican officials might even have added the words more bluntly. When the very first speaker spoke strongly on the role of women in the Church, it was actually a quite electric moment that I shall not easily forget. I shall always believe that the Synod was the important meeting that took place in Rome last year, and that in its long-term effects on our country, it will dwarf any other meeting that took place. A 1,000 kilometers or two north of Samoa is a group of tiny islands with 1,700 inhabitants, about 500 of whom are Catholics. There are 2 parishes on 2 islands several hundred kilometers apart, with 1 priest to look after both. The overwhelming social problem is the very high incidence of alcoholism among the adult male population. If the Church on those islands can speak to this problem, it is relevant. If it cannot speak to this problem, it is irrelevant. No other issue matters. I tell this story to indicate that synods in Rome have a habit of reminding those present of the universal Church and of its many needs, of reminding all of us that our own concerns are far from being the only concerns in the world. I shall remember the Synod as a positive and at times quite moving experience. So where to from now? At the end of the Synod, the Pope met with the Australian bishops, and he was not referring solely to the statement of conclusions when he said, "The Church in Australia faces a complex situation which calls for careful discernment. It is this discernment to which we are all called at the beginning of the 3rd millennium. It is not to be based on any one document, or even on all the things that were said at a synod, but on the total situation of our country at this time. The Church does not exist for its own sake, but for the sake of the world. It should never turn in on itself. The great Lutheran martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote from his prison cell during the Second World War, "The attack by Christians upon the adulthood of the world I consider to be, in the first place, pointless, in the second, ignoble, and in the third, unchristian. The place of religion is taken by the Church, but the world is made to depend on itself and left to its own devices, and that is all wrong." In recent weeks, we have been reminded of the size of the problems of drug abuse and youth suicide. Drugs and suicide begin to seem attractive when people have no answers to such questions as, who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going? What is the purpose and meaning of my existence on this planet? Advertising, the media, peer groups are not giving satisfying answers to these questions. And as long as they remain turned in on themselves, neither are the churches. So society is developing a whole range of responses to drugs and suicide, none of which touches the basic problem. We must all be deeply concerned about what our society and our church are saying to the young about the very reasons for existing, the very meaning of life. Ultimately, this is not a social, but a spiritual issue. For the same spiritual reasons, I believe that both in society and in the Church, we must, in the words of the Pope, carefully discern such matters as the place of women, the many forms of abuse of others that take place, the way we treat the marginalized, the insidious presence of racism. Both in the Church and in society, we must seek to discern how individualism and the good of the community can be balanced, how the need for a sustainable environment can be balanced with human progress, how Australia's development is to be balanced with our duties towards less endowed countries. I believe that again, within both society and church, we must proclaim incessantly that justice does not consist in the haves deciding what should be given to the have-nots, but in the haves humbly listening to the have-nots, in deciding together what should be the very values and structures of the society itself. This is not to deny that there are specifically church issues that need attention and resolution. It is a plea to all sides to keep the main work of the church before their eyes. I have neither the time nor the inclination to go around dobbing priests in for faults in liturgy. But excuse me, I'm also disappointed if that's the only part of my speech that was applauded. And I have no desire to attack those people who have difficulty with development and change in the church. In their letter, the Australian bishops invited prayerful collaboration in developing strategies to respond to the issues raised at all meetings in Rome, and in discerning the Pope's word, what the Spirit is asking of the Church in Australia at the beginning of the third millennium of Christianity. Speaking as one bishop, I meant that invitation with all my heart.
Thank you, Bishop Robinson. Now, I want to thank all our speakers, and I'll thank them again at the end of the night so you can save your applause. Now to your questions. Now, as I said previously, I'll just go through some housekeeping now. I'd like you to write them clearly on the sheet provided, and I think a lot of you took sheets out the front, and hand them to one of the collectors. I want to thank the senior students of Mount St Joseph's College Milperra and St Joseph's College Hunters Hill, who are going to be the agile runners running up and down. So you can start handing them if you want, just sort of wave your hand, and they'll come and collect them and take them to this table over here, which is presided over by Professor Tim O'Hearn, who will be sifting the questions and handing them up to me, and I'll put them to whomever you particularly want them addressed to, or if it's just to the panel, well, you know, I'll sort of make my judgment depending on the nature of the question. And we hope they will be as full and frank as possible, so please don't hold back. But we won't be taking questions from the floor. And look, while we're readying ourselves, just a couple of other things. Our version of the plate will be coming around. It wouldn't be a Catholic meeting without it. Baskets, in fact, I think it's to be, to encourage you to give what you think you can. Naturally, Catalyst has faced considerable costs in putting tonight's meeting on in the Town Hall. We are a volunteer group with just a couple of people paid the equivalent of religious stipends, and you can see out in the vestibule various details of our activities. We're trying to grow as an organisation to be of service to the Church, to meet some of the needs of the modern pilgrim people, as we've been discussing tonight. And there are membership forms out there, there are copies of the mix, there are details of spirituality in the pub and the various venues that have exploded around us. And I think many of you will probably know that when you're involved in these voluntary efforts, especially if you want to do well, you have to start thinking about raising enough money to start appointing people on full-time salaries to grow and develop Catalysts. So with volunteer groups these days, they only last for so long, and they get exhausted if there aren't people who can actually take up the cudgels in a full-time fashion and then guide people from there on in. So look, we'd really welcome all sorts of support. Please feel free to give what you can. If you feel very generous, we'd be very grateful, but I shall leave that up to you. But there'll be plenty of people standing around too, wearing these badges, if you'd like to ask any questions of Catalyst people and just find out more about our activities. Now, I'd just like, while we're gathering questions now, I also just want to read, before we start, a statement that Morris West, who's here with us tonight with his wife Joy, has faxed to us. And because we invited him and his wife to come along, and this is the statement that he wished us to read. One prays and hopes for the active exercise of the apostolic pastoral autonomy of our bishops, who alone can understand and interpret our needs as a pilgrim church. We pray that they'll find courage and voice in their fraternal counsel with the Pontiff and in their dealings with the Roman dicasteries, whose role it is and must be that of servants of the servants of God. So thank you, Morris West, for that statement. Now, do we have any questions that I can put?
Paul VI published his first encyclical, Ecclesiam Suam. He recalls Pope John XXIII's emphasis on aggiornamento, saying, "We want to recall it, aggiornamento, to mind as a stimulus to preserve the perennial vitality of the Church, her continuous awareness and ability to study the signs of the times, and her constantly youthful agility in scrutinizing it all carefully and retaining only what is good, always and everywhere. With this aggiornamento, or renewal, in mind, Pope Paul urged us to act through the dignity of dialogue. Act through the dignity of dialogue, which, he says, excludes the a priori condemnation, the offensive and time-worn polemic. He then continues, the dialogue is not proud, it's not bitter, it's not offensive. Its authority is intrinsic to the truth it explains, to the charity it communicates, to the example it proposes. It is not a command, it is not an imposition, it is peaceful, it avoids violent methods, it is patient, it is generous. Bishop Brian Heenan has returned to Sydney tonight. He went home after the Bishops' Conference last week. I believe it's been very generous and indeed brave of him to come back here. I know Brian is a deeply pastoral man, and I think you've seen that tonight. He has spoken of or witnessed to the deeply personal dimension. We can talk about the church in abstract terms, but he was a human being who went through the process, complex process, and he reminds us of the relativity of this meeting and the relativity of the document it produced. It's not a replacement for the Vatican documents. Sister Annette reminds us of the tension between the mystical body of Christ and being pilgrim church. We're a mystical reality, but we're also a footsore reality. And there are certain inconsistencies manifest in this document, which seem to be symptomatic perhaps of the Roman Curia, inconsistencies between the human reality that we find here on the ground in Australia and the way it's perceived. Robert has emphasised our need to embrace the modern world, to welcome the questions. Questions don't mean disloyalty. Conversation doesn't mean infidelity. We must struggle and see these questions as promise rather than threat. Bishop Robinson has asked us to bear in mind the perspective of it all, the context, the big picture, not get lost in this or that, certainly not become obsessed with this or that, witnessing to the gospel in response to the very real questions, the actual questions that are arising in the community, and a need for a discernment in this. What does the gospel ask of us today? What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus Christ in Australia at the end of this century? Pope John Paul II, in May 1995, about 30 years after Pope Paul VI wrote Ecclesiam Suam, Pope John Paul wrote his encyclical Ut Unum Sint, an encyclical I think that probably hasn't received enough attention. He emphasises dialogue here, using that word more than 100 times in that document. He recalls the biblical as well as contemporary understanding of the human person when he writes beautifully and insightfully, the capacity for dialogue is rooted in the nature of the person and human dignity. The human person is in fact, and here he quotes from Gaudium et Spes, is in fact the only creature on earth which God willed for itself. Thus we cannot fully find ourselves except through a sincere gift of ourselves. Dialogue is an indispensable step along the path toward human self-realization, the self-realization both of each individual and of every human community. In that spirit, ancient and ever new, a spirit which pertains to the very nature and dignity of the human person, we've come together tonight. We should do everything we possibly can to ensure that the Catholic Church in Australia develops that spirit in abundance. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Michael. It's a formidable job. Thank you very much. Now, just I do, just a nice little question Tim's just handed me. This is from Fathers Joe Duffy and John Dobson from Maroochydore and Caloundra. Two of us priests from the Sunshine Coast in Queensland regard tonight as so significant we've come down to the meeting. Beautiful one day, raining the next. Okay, I want to thank, again, I just want to take this opportunity to thank our patrons, which is in the page 2 of the mix. One of the fabulous things about the mix is it doesn't sort of weigh you down when you pick it up, and it's very enlivening, but you can read it relatively quickly without it becoming a burden. But on page 2, the patrons I want to acknowledge because they've really been with us. You know, we're, 4.5, 5 years old, and people lent their name to our efforts, and I want to thank them publicly now. Robert Fitzgerald, Gerald Gleeson, Professor Francis Maloney, Dr. Richard Mulhern, Geoffrey Robinson, the Reverend Bishop Geoffrey Robinson, Sister Deirdre Rofe, and Sister Annette Cunliffe. Will you please thank them on our behalf? We had a lot of apologies too. I won't read through them, but there were 10 bishops. The Papal Nuncio contacted us, and many volunteers have given of their services tonight. Lots of people who wish they could be here were not able to be, and I want to thank them in absentia. And again, all details out in the vestibule. Thank you very much for your attendance tonight. I think it has lived up to our expectations and been quite an historic night in many ways. I notice that Kathleen Tyrrell has joined us on stage, but Bishop Robinson, I invite him, would you please stand? We'll have a blessing and a final hymn, and thank you indeed for joining us tonight.
Two years before he joined the Catholic Church, John Henry Newman wrote in a letter to a friend, "There is nothing on this earth so ugly as the Catholic Church, and nothing so beautiful. Lord, thank you for the beauty. We have all seen the ugliness in its history and today. But none of us would be here tonight if we had not also seen the beauty and experienced that beauty. Thank you, Lord, for the presence of that beauty in our life. May we do all in our power to take away the ugliness, to let the beauty shine. And may you, God, bless us, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen."
Please join in.
O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the works thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, thy power throughout the universe
have been thinking about you.
Idiotic. I mean, I was asked to do a writing job by Senator Tate first, and that was to rewrite the Pledge of Allegiance, the Oath of Allegiance, they used to call it. That was 1994. Wrote him a nice one too, which people whose English was a bit dodgy could still pronounce. But the last line of it scared the government no end. I mean, it said, and I expect Australia to be loyal to me. They weren't going to have that. And so they rewrote it and butchered it into bureaucratese. Then, a few years later, I was asked by the other side in politics to write a draft preamble to the Constitution, so I did, and that brought down a storm, but it was mostly an organised storm. Very even-handed. I did it for the Labor Party once, I did it for the Liberal Country Party once, and they can both go and jump now.
But at the time, Prime Minister John Howard announced that you had been asked to write the preamble. He announced that I think it was Australia's best writer, or certainly his favourite poet.
Yeah.
Did he ever single out any of your poems as particular favourites?
No.
Or talk to you about your poetry?
No, we didn't talk about that at all. We talked about the old Sydney University songbook, which he knew better than I did. I mean, he was an evening student, and they went to long, dreary meetings of the Liberal Club after lectures at night, and they sang these songs from the Sydney University Liberal Club song, the Sydney University songbook. And we didn't talk a hell of a lot. We talked mostly business about the preamble, and I had no more contact with him after that.
You said at the time that Howard bowdlerised what you wrote.
He insisted on putting in the word mateship, which I said was out of register. It was the wrong term to use in that context, but he wanted it. He was the customer, which is why you don't do copywriting, because the person commissioning the copy has the right to change it. In poetry, you have the privilege of leaving it exactly as you wrote it, so I thought no more copywriting, not even as a favour. It wasn't a favour to Howard, by the way, it was a favour to Australia, I think, but...
You are someone who has commented on and watched the political scene for some years now.
I've tried to avoid the damn thing, it follows me around. It coincided, the rise of politics in Australia to its present, I think, overweening position has coincided with years in which I fought a disease called depression, and it followed me around, and it tended to get involved in the storms that were in my head, provide them with fuel, and I was trying to get away from it because it was bad for me.
Given that you do have this dislike for the political sphere, you do come out very strongly at certain times, and one of them was about the war in Iraq. You strongly opposed it. You likened it...
Did I strongly oppose it? I opposed it. I didn't mount any barricades or anything, but...
With words, you...
I just wrote an essay on the subject because I was asked to, and I thought the whole thing was a damn fool enterprise, and doubly damn fool that we should get mixed up in it. I mean, the Americans were clearly going to go in there and get themselves bogged down, and Australia would be pulled in as well. I couldn't work out why. I couldn't work out the real underlying reasons for the war. I still don't know them. I don't think we've ever been told them. I'm not sure the Americans knew themselves, but going to Iraq has not helped us at all against one of our traditional enemies, which is the American wheat lobby, who've done their damnedest to sink us through manipulating the charge of corruption. We should have seen that one coming. Nobody was going to do business with Saddam Hussein without lining his pockets, but the Americans managed to point the finger at us, and we took it seriously. Bloody idiots.
You don't think that's something we should have worried about, the whole wheat
not at all. I mean, any fool would know that you don't deal with a fellow like Saddam Hussein without lining his pockets. At least Saddam is not a madman. He's not a Hitler. He's a crim, but he's not a Hitler. A fella you can bribe is also a bloke you can do business with. You couldn't have done business with that, Alf.
You're listening to Sunday Profile on ABC Local Radio with me, Julia Baird, speaking to Les Murray, Australia's greatest living poet.
Biggest living poet.
No, at his home near Bunya in northern New South Wales.
At Bunya. Oh, yeah, at Bunya. Bunya is a wide, wide open sort of farming valley, mainly a pastoral valley these days, with hills about 1,000 to 2,000 feet, forested hills on either side of it.
You were speaking before about our cultural cringe being something that has continued throughout Australian history.
Yeah. There were a few times when we've broken through it, like there were a few times in the 19th century where we did good things, like making the secret ballot work. It had never been made to work before. It only ever been tried a few times in Greece, actually. But that made it possible to get social change without revolution, and that was terribly important. It probably saved millions and millions of lives around the world. You can't count lives that are saved. You can only count lives that are lost. But that and things like old age pensions and the basic wage and so on were terribly important. I do believe in that part of Labor history.
Well, one of the interesting things about you is that while you are shy from conventional politics, you've always been passionately interested in what it means to be Australian, and you've written about our identity in a way that others haven't really touched on.
Yeah,
which
because usually they're touching some party line. I don't like parties, and I like to think outside the box if I can.
Well, what is it that's distinctive about the Australian identity today?
It tends to be a little bit furtive. It likes to do things under the lap and not be heavily declarative about it. Anybody making big declarations in Australia tends to be suspect, including me.
How do you think Australia has changed over your lifetime?
Oh, it's become... I hate the word multicultural because it's like shoving down your throat something which is already there and doesn't need to be shoved down your throat, you know. It happened naturally anyway, and then it became a policy. The upshot of the policy was that all the dislike which Australian elites have always felt for average Australians were able to find expression. It became what I once called a system of racism directed against Australians. I said that in the Sydney Town Hall to an audience of 2,000 Greeks, and the walls swelled outward slightly when they heard these terrible words pronounced. But it was a massive cultural cringe. We're prepared to cringe to every nationality in the country, except perhaps the Ukrainians, whom the government doesn't like, and put ourselves down. You know, there's another way of putting Australians down. I think we put Australians down a lot more than we used to. That's one big change. Or rephrase the sentence, we put Australians down even more than we used to.
Well, there's been some critics of the current government who say that we've become meaner as a country over the last 10 years.
I've always found Australian governments mean, to tell you the truth. I remember once going to Britain and we fell into unemployment. We were still members of what then was, I suppose, the tail end of the British Empire. And we found over there that when we were in need, we were treated politely. The dull people came around to our place to talk to us and fill in the forms. They were polite, they were kind, they were accommodating. We'd never seen that from our own welfare in Australia. Our own welfare treated the poor like that. They made you crawl on the ground before they gave you, 2 and 6. And I've always found Australian governments to be, because their origins, I guess, are in the police commissary, in the convict system, they always treat the needy like dirt.
What did you make of the debate over the detention of asylum seekers?
Nothing much, because it's been so extremely pushed that I figure, this is politicised, this is this is one of those tests, if you don't pass this test, you get thrown out of the intelligentsia or the brownies or something. Which is why you asked me the question, by the way.
Well, no, I asked the question because I read a comment of yours where you said you think that people should come here, have their claims tested within a week. If they're not accepted, they should be sent back.
Yep, I figure that's fair. Have your claims tested. Don't be mistreated. Don't be imprisoned and so on. Just have your claims tested in a civilised fashion.
So you seem to have some concerns about it, but you don't want to be lumped with the...
I don't want to be put in with anybody's big lobby gang whose motives may not have much to do with the asylum seekers, but might have everything to do with trying to change the government.
Sure. And of course, one of the things which has been on the political radar over the last couple of weeks, again, you've always been very passionate about the Aboriginal community and culture, and we seem to go through these cycles where the media is interested in it, whether it's domestic violence over the last couple of weeks or alcoholism. And what do you think is going on with the way that we think about our history and our heritage? And
possibly not enough else was happening that week to talk about in the media. I mean, the papers have to sell every day, don't they? I don't know who cares about Aborigines and how much they care, and whether white people caring about Aborigines ever helps the Aborigines much. I'd like to hear much more from Aborigines and much less from whitefellas.
You said once that you'd like to have your ancestry tested to see if you actually have any...
It'd be interesting to know. I don't know what I would do in any given case, but it'd just be interesting to know. And Jim Spiegelman the other day, the Chief Justice of New South Wales, said that millions of Australians probably have some Aboriginal ancestry, and I thought, millions? Yeah, it's probably true. And it'd be interesting to know just who, you know.
Would it change the way you thought about yourself?
Probably not very deeply. This north coast of ours has always had a quiet Aboriginal dimension to it culturally. A lot of cultural mixing went on up here. Cultural and probably inevitably racial mixing went on up here. Some people were concerned to hide it. Some people successfully hid it. Other times you'd be told, oh, that family, the so-and-sos, they're black. And you'd look at them and say, they look just as blonde or red-headed or freckly as anybody else, but no, they're black. They've got Aboriginal ancestry. And it's such a terrible pity that it's been a matter of stigma. That stigma came from India, I think. The British, when they first settled in India, or British East India Company, they used to give a gold coin for every mixed-race child that was born. They are encouraging the British officers there to have Indian wives and children. And then it all reversed. After the Indian Mutiny, it became a great shame and disgrace. The British women started coming to India to find husbands amongst the British officers and so on. And it became a tremendous disgrace. And the Anglo-Indians, as they're called, were treated like dirt, and still are. And they're very cagey about ever admitting that they are Anglo-Indian. I've known a few of them. That thing came to Australia too. There was a nice intermingling of the races happening in Australia, and then suddenly it got switched off. And I blame the women for it, the British women, the non-convict women, the free settler women, who turned it off in the manner of India and made it a disgrace.
Look, let's talk about the pocket of Australia you grew up in and still live in, which has had such a strong influence on the way you see the country.
Yeah.
You grew up in Bunya, in rural New South Wales.
Part of the well-watered part of Australia.
Right. In rural New South Wales, but you had a difficult childhood. You experienced severe bullying at school, the death of your mother.
I think it was partly, I was bullied at school largely because I was a little bit autistic, you know, a little bit kind of, bit Asperger's, not having many social skills and not quite knowing how to deal with other people because I was an only child as well. I mean, it's bad training for an Asperger to be an only child as well. Yeah.
So what did it mean for you to have Asperger's?
It's no disadvantage to a large extent. I mean, it made me studious and thoughtful and capable of enjoying being solitary and enjoying my own company, which I've always done. Not being reliant on other people's opinion.
It's difficult when you come to relate to people then? Is that where the problem is?
Can be. It takes a long time to learn stuff. Some people seem to come into the world knowing social stuff and have a gift for it. And it's something I find slightly enviable because I've just never had it. I'd have to spend 2 days working out what they can do instinctively.
You once said, when there was a chance of being lost in the world, Bunya was always my anchor.
Yeah.
Bunya, marriage and religion have been my securities in my precarious life as a poet.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the woman you've been married to since 1962, Valerie Morelli. There's a wonderful story about how you met. You were playing Satan.
I was playing Satan and she was wardrobe mistress in a German mystery play at the Great Hall that's in the university. And she made me a cloak of red lined with yellow. And I wore a pig mask. I had to be hideous and...
There's very few wives who get the chance to dress their future husbands up as Beelzebub.
As Satan, yeah. She knew what she was getting, you know.
So is there something between you straight away? Is she...
Pretty much, I think, yeah.
Yeah?
And, I took a great interest in her immediately, and it has not abated. And she's been the principle of good sense and reason and so on in my life ever since. I'm by no means reliably sane, you know, and she's been the principle of sanity.
You must have written her poems.
Yeah, but I tend to be a reticent sort of fella about these things, you know, things close to the heart. I once wrote a very little poem, which is not for her, it's just in general. It says, the truest love poems are known as such to the lovers alone. Yeah, it's hard to know sometimes in my work which were the love poems. You know? There are one or two of them that are explicit.
Explicit about what?
Our great friendship, for one thing, and things we have in common. But she's done various arts, and whenever she masters one, when she's really good at it, she drops it. Because, she's done that now. She's got all the juice out of it. And I wrote this poem about how amazed I was that she had very serious gifts in art, but she wasn't obsessed. Not driven, not obsessive. I couldn't understand it.
Well, I'm not sure if this was partly the influence of your wife, but while you were brought up Presbyterian, 2 years after you married Valerie, you converted to Roman Catholicism.
Which I'd really converted to inwardly about 5 years before I met her.
How did that conversion happen then?
Oh, when I struck it, it fascinated me. It was the most poetical form of Christianity I'd struck. It was the one that made sense to me.
In what way?
I liked the idea of a metaphor going all the way to being true. A person could be bread and wine, and not just like bread and wine, but could be bread and wine. The idea of the sacrament, it just fascinated me. And gradually also my other main argument for it was that there's a lot of human sacrifice in the world. We're continually being called upon to sacrifice ourselves in various ways, quite literally pour out our blood, This is one fellow who says, I'll pour out my blood, and you don't have to anymore. The best two Catholic lines I ever wrote were, how's it go now? The true God gives his flesh and blood. Idols demand yours off you.
As you mentioned earlier, you have struggled with depression for many years. But where was God during those times when it's particularly acute?
Where would I have been without him? Probably dead. I mean, a lot of us die. A lot of us commit suicide.
And your faith?
Yeah, you don't do that if you're, or you're less likely to do it if you've got a religion telling you not to and telling you that you will be cared for, that you're part of an eternal scheme, not just a temporary scheme which finishes when you switch it off. I mean, I've known quite a number of people who've committed suicide. I never say a word against them. I can understand what took them there, but I was never tempted to do it myself, and I'd put that down to Catholicism for one thing.
You've also written a poem about poetry and religion. Can you read it to us now?
Yeah. Religions are poems. They concert our daylight and dreaming mind, our emotions, instinct, breath, and native gesture into the only whole thinking, poetry. Nothing's said till it's dreamed out in words, and nothing's true that figures in words only. A poem compared with an arrayed religion may be like a soldier's one short marriage night to die and live by. But that is a small religion. Full religion is the large poem in loving repetition. Like any poem, it must be inexhaustible and complete with turns where we ask, now why did the poet do that? You can't pray a lie, said Huckleberry Finn. You can't poe one either. It is the same mirror. Mobile, glancing, we call it poetry. Fixed centrally, we call it a religion. And God is the poetry caught in any religion, caught, not imprisoned. Caught as in a mirror that he attracted, being in the world as poetry is in the poem, a law against its closure. There'll always be religion around while there is poetry, or a lack of it. Both are given and intermittent, as the action of those birds, crested pigeon, rosella parrot, who fly with wings shut, then beating, and again shut.
I love that poem, Les.
Good.
Can you remember what inspired it?
I'm just thinking of the relationship between the two, poetry and religion, how they are both about value and the meaning we put into things, and the meaning more particularly that we discover in things or are given to see in things. And I guess it grew from the expression in Huckleberry Finn, you can't pray a lie. And I thought, yeah, well, you can't poe one either. You can't deliberately lie in poetry. You can be wrong, but you can't lie.
You've described writing poems as like being in a trance or inwardly dancing.
It's a dance and a trance and a matter of thought all at once. The unconscious mind and the conscious mind are in some kind of dance with each other, and the body is involved as well. My wife reckons she can always tell when I'm writing because I breathe as if I'm asleep. It's sort of the breathing of a person who's dreaming.
You wrote once that it will be centuries before men are truly at home in this country. Are you at home here yet?
Yep. Yeah, I was wrong in that one. It's not such a hell of a good poem. It's a bit too long. It's Prentice work. It's an early poem. There's a couple of good bits in it.
How do you respond to people who say you are quintessentially Australian?
Oh, well, I suppose if they mean it kindly, I smile and nod and say yes, thank you.
Les Murray, thanks for joining us on Sunday Profile.
Pleasure to be there.
And that's Les Murray, one of the world's greatest living poets. If you'd like to listen again, read the transcript or drop us a note, please check out our website at abc.net.au/Sunday Profile. I'm Julia Baird. Thanks for listening. Coming up next, Karen Durante with Speaking Out.
Now, Speaking Out with Karen Durante on ABC Local Radio.
Hello and welcome to Speaking Out. My name is Karen Durante. Great to be with you on this Sunday evening. On the show tonight, Rolf de Heer talks about 10 Canoes, the film he made with the Yolngu people of Ramingining. First up though, do you think schools should be shut down in remote Aboriginal communities without a real economy? And should Aboriginal culture be taught in schools or left to parents to teach at home? These questions have been raised in a report being considered by the federal government. The report by the Menzies Research Centre was written by Bennelong Society President Gary Johns, a former minister in the Keating government. Dr. Chris Sarra has joined us to challenge some of the report's proposals. You might know him as the Aboriginal principal who developed a program that got Aboriginal children attending school and learning. That program was developed at the state school in the Aboriginal community of Cherbourg in southwest Queensland. The story goes that when Dr. Sarra became principal in 1998, none of the children were turning up. Those that did learnt very little and discipline problems were rife. Now the children enjoy learning and literacy and numeracy standards have improved dramatically. Dr. Sarra has since moved on and is now the director of the Indigenous Education Leadership Institute. Dr. Sarra, what do you think of the suggestion to remove Aboriginal culture from the school curriculum?
Yeah, I think it's just a little bit silly, and probably what's even more silly is that it seems to be taken so seriously by the Commonwealth Government. There's nothing to be afraid of when it comes to teaching Indigenous studies in schools, and in fact it's quite crucial as a means to getting better literacy and numeracy outcomes for children. And as well as that, it's a great thing for non-Indigenous children, for white Australians to learn about Aboriginal culture in schools too.
So not only should it be taught at schools where there's a high proportion of Indigenous students, but even if there are no Indigenous students in that school?
Yeah, it should be taught in every school, and you know, there's a lot of discrepancy data around that clearly underlines the extent of misunderstanding of Aboriginal people in this country, and it can only be a healthy thing if we work harder at better understanding each other.
And what about the other suggestion, closing schools in remote communities that are not economically viable?
Again, this is another nonsense type suggestion. It's all a part of a media frenzy that's gone on recently, and I think people should just slow down and settle down. With remote communities, you know, there's no denying that there are degrees of dysfunction in remote Indigenous communities, but it's important to understand that a lot of the poverty that we see, impoverishment that we see in those sorts of communities has actually been engineered by white Australian policies of the past. So it's a little bit rich to come in at this stage and say, well, let's close these places down, when in fact they've been engineered, that degree of poverty and dysfunction has been engineered by things like stolen wages processes and all of those kinds of things.
What about the author's concern about the cultural curtain? That is how Aboriginal culture is sometimes used as an excuse to avoid participation in schooling. The author does in fact quote your experience at Cherbourg.
Yeah, quotes me on the first page in a kind of an underhanded way, which is a little bit disappointing, I must say, but you know, that you can't control those kinds of things. What was very clear to me is that we had to change ourselves as a school first, and we certainly weren't hiding behind any cultural curtain, and I don't think I've seen any Aboriginal parents say that they don't value education. One of the things that the report said was that schooling must be made compulsory for Aboriginal children. Well, in fact, school is compulsory for Aboriginal children, and the way it's presented, it's like Aborigines and communities are trying to make out that they don't want to go to school. Well, that's not what Aboriginal people are saying. Similarly, there is the suggestions that this cultural curtain exists around things like child abuse and rape of women in communities, and what I'm hearing from the media is a lot of white people saying that this is what Aborigines say. I haven't seen any Aboriginal person say those type of things, you know, the things that we've been accused of, and I challenge the media to show me one Aboriginal man that says that it's okay or that it's culturally sound rape our women or to abuse our children. I challenge them. And if they can produce one Aboriginal man that says that, then I can show you a man who should be locked up.
I detect a degree of frustration from there. I guess with National Reconciliation Week wrapping up, that this has possibly been a frustrating one for you?
Yeah, very frustrating, only in the sense that we've been dramatically misrepresented by some irresponsible white Australians. There are so many, really great white Australians out there who know and understand that this is not the real Aboriginal Australia that's being described in this media frenzy by just a few irresponsible white Australians who should really know better. I think it's time to just calm down, take it easy. And I'd really encourage white Australia just to see us for who we really are as Aboriginal people and embrace us for who we are. We're not a group of people to be feared or despised or anything like that. And to Aboriginal Australia, I say, let's just hold our ground and be who we are. We know who we are. We know that we're not the people that this media frenzy is describing, and these very few irresponsible white Australians.
I'm Karen Durante, and with me on Speaking Out tonight is Dr. Chris Sara, Director of the Indigenous Education Leadership Institute in Cherbourg. You're clearly concerned that if this report is embraced by the federal government and becomes policy, what do you think will happen if that does happen?
It's disastrous if we think that we should reject any notion of teaching Aboriginal culture in schools, because for any child, whether it's a Vietnamese child, Chinese child, Middle Eastern child, white Australian child, it's a necessary part of the process of the pursuit of better literacy numeracy outcomes to embrace a child's cultural identity as part of that process. You can't just pretend that a child's Aboriginal identity doesn't exist and then expect to get better literacy numeracy outcomes. If you pretend that we should reject it or pretend it's not there or completely keep it out of schools, then we move back to a time when we just make schools that completely alienate in place that they have been in the past, and then schools don't make sense to kids anymore. This was the strength of the strong and smart philosophy. Strong meant strong and proud to be Aboriginal. Smart meant smart enough so that we can mix it with anybody else. And it's all a necessary part of the process, because when we started talking about strong and smart in schools, all of a sudden school made sense for the kids in Cherbourg, and they were hooked on it and hooked on learning, and they wanted to be a part of it.
Strong and Smart is the program that you developed there at Cherbourg.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
What's actually happened with that program? Is it still running in Cherbourg now that you've left?
Yeah, the philosophy still exists and the children are still talking about it, and the parents in the community significantly are still insisting on it. So any educator that goes near Cherbourg State School knows that their actions has to be aligned with the pursuit of stronger, smarter outcomes for those children. Now, those educators, they either get with that philosophy or the pursuit of that philosophy, or they get rolled by it.
And has it branched out to other state schools in the area, or has it gone national? What's happened?
Yeah, I guess I've been travelling more nationally now, and you see some great things happening around the country. It's worth noting, for instance, there's a young guy, Leon Proud, who's principal of Horn Island School. He's a young non-Indigenous guy, but he's got that school chanting out that they're the clever, confident and caring school, and everything that happens in their school hangs off being clever, confident and caring, and it just makes really good sense. It's a part of getting better literacy numeracy outcomes, but it's also a part of embracing the cultural identity of the Torres Strait Islander children.
But it sounds like it's individual schools that are embracing the kind of program that you developed at Cherbourg. It doesn't sound like it's education policy.
No, and I guess that's the scary thing about, if the Commonwealth Government is entertaining such silly notions of rejecting Aboriginal culture in schools. But I think it kind of emphasises one of the points that I've been making all along in this debate, and that is, if we wait for political leadership on this issue, then we'll be waiting forever. We've just got to wait. We've just got to stand up as white Australians and black Australians together, stand up at a community level and be united. And let's reject any of this sort of nonsense about pretending that we don't exist or trying to rule Aboriginal culture out of schools. What really counts is the leadership at the local community level, both black and white.
Well, you're the director of the Indigenous Education Leadership Institute. Is it going to be your job to counter what are very persuasive arguments in that Menzies policy report?
We'll certainly be doing our part to counter such nonsense and stupidity, and we'll do that probably more by trying to inspire principals around the country in schools where there are high numbers of Indigenous children to do the right thing by their children in those schools. And it's not the right thing to pretend that their cultural identity doesn't exist. What is the right thing is to embrace their cultural identity, not at the expense of better literacy and numeracy outcomes, but as a crucial and fundamental part of the process of pursuing that.
Dr. Chris Sara, Director of the Indigenous Education Leadership Institute in Cherbourg, Queensland.
You're with Karen Durante, speaking out on ABC Local Radio.
Long time ago, 10 of us men went on the swamp to hunt the eggs of kumang, the magpie goose. This young one was thinking wrong thoughts. So this old fella tell him a story. A story before a long time ago. Before we can remember. This story has too many words. But not enough women. There's war in the story. And sorcery. And the belly is as big as a mountain. There's wrong love. And there's wrong revenge. Maybe it's a bad ending. Maybe it's a good one. It's not like your story. It's my story. My story you've never seen before.
David.
Pope Paul VI published his first encyclical, Ecclesiam Suam. He recalls Pope John